This Notebook LM video explores how the word heretic shifted from its original meaning of choice, or school of thought, to being linked with harsh punishment and even death. It's one of history's most striking contradictions, a system that justified killing in the name of a man who preached, "Love your enemies."
Okay, let's start with a question. When I say the word heretic, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For most people, it's something pretty dark, right? Maybe you're thinking of a traitor, someone who completely betrays their own people, their own faith.
Or it could be a blasphemer, someone who's not just disagreeing, but actively thumbing their nose at God.
At the end of the day, the word basically screams enemy, right? Someone so dangerous, so threatening that for centuries, the only answer was punishment, exile, even death. But here's the twist. What if I told you that's not what the word meant at all? Not even close.
So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to dive deep into the absolutely wild story of how a totally normal, everyday word got twisted over time and turned into a literal death sentence. And to really get this, we've got to go all the way back. I'm talking way back to the original Greek of the New Testament. So the word we now know as heresy actually comes from this Greek word heresis. And get this, its original meaning was simply choice. Yeah, choice, or a school of thought. It wasn't negative at all. It was just a neutral way to describe different groups, like the Pharisees or the Sadducees. It was just a choice of what to believe. In fact, this is going to blow your mind. In the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul himself is defending his faith. And he basically says, yeah, I follow the heresy, the school of thought of the Nazarenes. He literally identified as a heretic in the original sense of the word. He was owning his choice. Okay, so if the word just meant choice, and a guy like the Apostle Paul was cool with it, then what did the Bible actually say you should do with a so-called heretic?
And this right here is where it gets really wild. The word heretic only shows up one single time in the whole New Testament. One time. And the instruction is pretty simple. Warn someone who's causing division once, then twice. If they still don't listen, you reject them. That's it. Basically, you stop hanging out with them. So how in the world did we get from stop hanging out with them to, burning them at the stake?
Well, an idea that big and that terrifying doesn't just pop up overnight. No, this was built carefully, piece by piece, over hundreds of years. The whole case for execution rests on four main pillars. They started by digging into the Old Testament, they brought in some heavy-hitting philosophy, they baked it into Roman law, and then, the final step, they called it spiritual treason. It really began when theologians started looking back at Old Testament laws, the ones that called for death for things like idolatry, and they just kind of stretched those to apply to disagreements among Christians. And a huge turning point comes with the philosopher Augustine of Hippo. He was a real game changer here. He took this one little line from a parable in the Gospel of Luke, compel them to come in, and he ran with it. He argued that it meant the government had a duty to use force to bring people back to the right belief, to save their souls. For Augustine, heresy was way worse than murder. I mean, murder only kills the body, right? Heresy, he argued, kills the soul forever. And that's the key right there. The moment church and state power merged, once Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, suddenly disagreeing on doctrine wasn't just a church problem anymore. It was a political problem. It was a threat to the stability of the empire. And boom, under the Theodosian Code in 438, just believing the wrong thing officially became a crime against the state. It was treason.
But think about it. To justify killing someone for what's in their head, you have to do some serious rebranding. Just calling it a choice isn't going to cut it. You need something more. And that's exactly what they did. Heresy got a total, terrifying makeover. It wasn't just a different opinion anymore. Oh no. Now it was an act of war against God. It was a cancer, a disease in the body of Christ that had to be cut out before it infected everyone. It was, simply put, spiritual treason. And the punishment for treason? Death. Let's look at a real-world example of one of these schools of thought that got wiped out, the Gnostics. Now, the Gnostics were all about personal revelation, a direct connection to God. They believed some people, who they called pneumatics, could achieve salvation through their own inner spiritual knowledge. Now, can you see the problem? If people can find God on their own, well, what do you need priests and bishops for? That idea was a direct threat to the entire power structure of the church.
So you see, this was never just some dusty theological debate. This whole system, this ideological machine, it had real, devastating human consequences that played out for centuries.
We'll never know the true number, of course. So many records are lost. But we have the names of at least 309 people, 309 individuals who were publicly killed just for the crime of what they believed.
And these weren't just anonymous numbers. We're talking about names you absolutely know. People like Joan of Arc, burned alive for saying she heard the voice of God.
Thinkers like Giordano Bruno, executed for the crime of suggesting the universe might be infinite. Poets and reformers like Askew, who was tortured on the rack before being burned for her Protestant faith.
And it wasn't just rebels, it went all the way to the top. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury himself, was executed for his beliefs. So when you put it all together, what are you left with? You're left with one of the most staggering and honestly challenging contradictions in all of history. Think about it. An entire system, both legal and religious, was built from the ground up to justify killing people, all in the name of a man who famously said, "Love your enemies," and who refused to use violence even to save his own skin. It's a lot to wrap your head around. And this history leaves us with a question that's just as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago. A really uncomfortable question. When does what someone believes become a crime? And maybe even more important, who gets to make that call?